Hey everyone! Today I'm going to be walking you through how to sew the Delphine Thong. I'm going to be showing you how to sew it with the lace leg line variation. This is one that I just made up. It's the high waist version, but today I'm going to be sewing the low rise variation. But the techniques for sewing them are basically identical. So this is the high waist variation. You can see it's got a very cheeky thong back with this V-shaped lace detailing around the leg line. So I've cut out all of my pieces. This is the front upper and the front lower. And I'm going to start by sewing the front lower together down this straight side, or this straight center front seam. So I'm going to put my pieces together, right side together. And I'm going to sew this together using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, making sure that the bottom edge of my lace is lined up nicely. And I'm just going to run this through my serger, and then we're going to get ready to sew the lower half to the top half. So here it is now that I've sewn this piece of lace together down the center front seam, and I've just opened up my upper front as well. So I'm going to start by placing my lace right sides together against my upper front. I'm just going to stick a couple pins in there to hold it in place. And using my sewing machine, I'm going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance to sew all the way down this edge, stopping at my seam line, which should be about 1/2 inch up from this point. So I'm using a very narrow zigzag stitch to attach the lace to the fabric. I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to stitch all the way to this seam line, making sure that I'm directly 1/2 inch above the point of my upper front. So I'm just going to sink my needle in. I'm going to lift up my foot, taking a pair of sharp scissors. I'm just going to slash along the stitching line of the lace towards the needle. This is what's going to allow us to have a nice sharp point. There. Now that we've slashed that, we can just gently start moving the lace along the remainder of our seam. So there it is. That lets us have a nice sharp point without any puckers. And you can see from this side how I've slashed just down that stitching line right to our new seam line. So the front of the panties are now complete, so I'm going to set them aside, and the assembly of the back is completely the same. So you're just going to start by sewing your lace piece together down that center back seam so that your lace is the right side together. And then just like we did before, you'll pin it along one side first, sew it with this 1/2 inch seam, slash towards that point, and then continue along. So I'm just going to do that really quickly. So there again, it's a nice sharp corner. So at this point, you can serge each one of these seams. So here's my gusset piece. I've cut an exterior layer out of lace and one out of just plain cotton jersey that coordinates with my lace color. And I've just laid them so that the wrong sides are together, just kind of overlapping them like that. And what we're going to do is finish the edges with elastic and then attach them to our front and back panties. So you've got a couple of options. You can either use like a decorative or picot edge elastic, or you can use a fold over elastic here. I think I will use just a fold over elastic on mine. So I've got white fold over elastic here, and I'm going to start by zigzag stitching it onto the wrong side. So I'm working from the jersey side of my gusset, and I'm just going to apply the fold over elastic along each outer edge and really lightly pull on the elastic to create a nice snug fit. So if you're using like a decorative edge elastic, your gusset will end up a little bit narrower than if you're using fold over, and I don't recommend using anything too wide. Like 3/8 of an inch is probably the widest that you're going to want to use. So I'm just going to go ahead and do the same thing on the opposite side. You could also use a really narrow stretch lace. Just anything to give the edge a bit of a contour. So there it is, and if I flip it over, it looks something like this, and I'm just going to trim back the excess. So just trimming it close to the stitching line. If you've sewn any of my patterns before, this is going to be old news. You're going to know how to do this already. Okay, so I've just cleaned up the edges. I'm going to fold the elastic along the fold line and, still using a zigzag stitch, just top stitch it in place. There we go. That's our completed gusset. So at this point we can take our panties front, and I just lay them on so that this seam line is running down the middle and that the edges are just covered. So I'm just going to stick a pin here. Here. Just want to make sure it's symmetrical on either side. And then one in the center. And then using a tight zigzag stitch, I'm just going to go along this edge to anchor it together. So using the zigzag stitch, I'm just going over the edge of my lace, attaching it directly on top of the gusset, and stitching through all the layers. So just at that point, sink your needle into the garment, and then you can pivot it and continue along the other way. And just be sure to do a good back tack at the start and end of your stitching line. So there that is. So you have two options from here. You can either just trim along that stitching line, or you can do another row of zigzag stitching straight across the top of your gusset and just trim back any excess, and that is how the gusset gets attached to the panties front. So I've decided to just do a row of zigzag stitching straight across that gusset edge. And at this point, we can move on and attach the back panties to this narrow edge of the gusset. So with the right sides facing, I'm just going to pin this to this little tiny seam here and just sew it together using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So the seam line, the center back seam line on your lace portion, it should line up approximately down the middle of the gusset. You may need to slightly adjust your lace so that you get a nice join. And then you can serge this edge, flip it up, and just do a little bit of zigzag stitching across here to anchor it in place. So now I've serged along here, just this little short seam. You don't have to do it. I just do it to keep things a little neater. And then pressing the seam allowance up towards the center back, I'm going to use a zigzag stitch to just anchor that in place. Back tacking at the beginning and end of your stitching line. So it's coming together quickly now. We just have a couple more steps to do, and there's our back. So now we can sew together one of the side seams. So just lining up your seam lines, making sure that they join nicely, and making sure that the lace scallops at the end, at the bottom, are also aligned nicely. We can just sew this together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and finish it with your serger, or with a zigzag stitch, whatever you want. I like to use my my regular sewing machine first, almost like to baste it in place, and then I use the serger to really trim back my seam allowance. So here we've got our first side seam done, and we're ready to move on to the waist elastic. And I'm actually going to use a 1/2 inch bra band elastic around that edge, but you could use a decorative elastic or a fold over elastic. I just like something that's a little more sturdy around the waistline of a lower rise panty. So that's what I'm going to use, but you could also use a fold over elastic. So here's the elastic I'm using. It's actually super stretchy plush back band elastic, but it's nice and stretchy and actually makes great waistbands as well. So I'm going to start on the right side of my garment. If you're using fold over elastic, do it just like we did on the gusset. I've got the plush side of my elastic facing up, and this little decorative edge is facing down towards the bottom. And I'm using a zigzag stitch. When in doubt, just use a zigzag stitch. And I'm very gently pulling on the elastic. When I get to this side seam, I just make sure that the seam allowance is pushed towards the center back. So here we are so far. I've got the elastic zigzag stitched along that one edge. And now, I think this is how I'm going to do it. Yeah, I'm gonna finish my side seam now. Sometimes I complete my elastic and then finish the side seam, and that, or vice versa. So I always have to stop and think about it. So just again, just like before, making sure that your seam lines where your lace meets your fabric lines up nicely and your elastic lines up as well. Sew these together using a 1/2 inch seam allowance and then serge your edges. And if you need to, just trim back any of your excess fabric that extends beyond the stitching line of your elastic. Mine is pretty good, except for this one little area here. Got a little out of control. So I just kind of fidget it around as I'm sewing it to make sure everything's lining up nicely. With these short seams and stretchy fabric, you can kind of ease things together a little better without it affecting the overall fit of the garment. There. So before you serge that, just make sure that you're happy with the join of your elastic and the lace. So I've sewn my final side seam together and serged it, and I've also just attached a label on here. And now I'm ready to finish my elastic. So I'm just going to start at this side seam and just turn the elastic towards the back so that the decorative edge just kind of peeks out over the fold. And I've switched my thread, so I've got kind of a mint thread on the top. And I'm going to do a multi-step zigzag stitch that's quite wide and tight. So this type of stitch allows for a lot of stretch. So I just do a little back tack when I get all the way around to the opposite end, or to the end where I started. Trim back your threads, and that's it. So you've got kind of a cheeky thong with a low rise and a nice stable waist, and these are really cute on. I'm not usually a huge thong fan, but I really like these. I hope you found that helpful. This video includes some techniques that are just like good to know, like how to do this sharp point. So hopefully you'll be able to apply that to some of your other sewing projects as well. Thanks. Bye.